Now that technically we are a single one income family, we have more money than we ever had working together.
No, you make a great point. And one of the things I do want us to recognize is when God said the house is out of order,
Mm.
we didn't understand what that meant. But if the house is out of order, everything else that's supposed to be aligned with it is also out of order. So the financial blessings, right? The
Mhm.
spiritual blessings, the overflow of all those components are skewed because we're out of order,
Mhm.
right? And I just remember the analogy of about a car being in alignment, right? If the car is out of alignment,
The
you
whole car's out of alignment.
literally, and you gonna be in the ditch,
Mhm.
and or you constantly struggling to get it back in order, like get it back on the road, like you literally fighting it, right? And how many of us have been in the
Yeah.
relationship fighting the very thing that we're trying to get and reestablish order to without knowing what that looked like? And the finances was a big one, husband, because let's be real, because we were out of order. That meant you were not the responsible party seeking God's face on provision for the household, right?
Mhm.
Because why? Because you was looking at me and we looking at each other, right? And so what that meant was you literally said, hey, I work, I bring home the paycheck, but you handle the bills. You didn't want to have no conversations regarding money. So guess what? Automatically be out of order.
Well, I think that, and you kind of hit it on the head. You know, when you establish a lifestyle with a two-party income, I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do. But even if you do that, so if your spouse is working, it still has to be some order in that, because we would never tell anybody to that, hey, only the man should be working and the woman should be home, or vice versa. What we will encourage you that if both of you are working, there's still an order to that. It's just not going to work for the sake of paying bills and trying to provide. It's the man still going to God and learning how to manage the finances through him. So that way, and like I mentioned earlier, at one point we were both working and we was broke. And we wasn't broke because the money wasn't there. We was broke because the household was out of order. So the money was going everywhere, right? There was no budgeting. I didn't want anything to do with that. There was no savings. I didn't want anything to do with that. So a lot of things that we as men are called to do. Now I know some of the men, Danielle, that are watching this, to say, "Oh, okay, well I'm pretty good at that." Because a lot of men know how to budget and plan, and that's good. That's good. But you should be planning a budget with the Holy Spirit involved as well. It's important that because God owns it all. It's His resources. It's His money, and his main goal is to make sure we're doing right by His money, right? So He owns it all, and He's just put us in place to manage it.
No, that is so good. So good. Because guess what? How many couples do we work with that, yeah, one is a budgeter and one is a spender?
Yeah.
The goal is for both parties to be on God's page, which brings the proper balance so you walk together as one. So instead of, guess what, ordering stuff and hiding it,
Or when the Amazon truck pull up.
right, or having delivered at the neighbor's house and you go and confiscate it later, right?
It's funny you say that
Yeah.
because we had a neighbor back in Chicago. Uh, he had like one of those sport motorcycles, and he used to order things to make it go faster. And he would come home and say, "Antoine, I got some stuff coming to your house, and my wife won't see what I ordered." Again, that's not of God, right? At the end of the day, and who's to say that his wife didn't want him to have that? But again, it's sitting down and say, "Hey, if you're into motorcycles or you're into any hobby, it's just really sitting down on both sides, say, hey, I want to do this. What does this look like in the budget?" And going back to God, and because it's His money, and making sure that's what He wants you to do with it.
Yeah, because you know what we discover is the funny thing is, so just so you know, I was we both had the income, right? We talked about that we had a two household income, but then God told me to leave my job. And he told me to leave my job because that job was interfering with the purpose that he was trying to establish with my husband.
Which
And that,
was the order,
correct, getting him back in order. And this is the thing, because my husband refused to get in alignment with God.
not getting me back in order,
Well,
but because I was never in order, so it wasn't getting me back in order. it was showing me that I was out of order. I was never in order. It's not like I was in order and stepped out of order. So because I didn't know how to be in order, what that looked like. So he was never trying, but he was trying to establish it the right way, the proper way, like he did, back in the garden.
Correct. And how did you receive that?
I didn't want any parts of that. As a man, when you're called to do something that's uncomfortable, and let me be transparent, brothers. You going to church has nothing to do with you being spiritually connected with God. That's just doing something to be compliant. If we're being truthful, so you can talk about it around the water cooler. The spiritual nature of what God is trying to get men is to get them back in the rightful place in which it was supposed to be established in the garden. Now, here's the thing here. When my wife, right, my wife brought to my attention that something's wrong with our house, and I don't know if you knew it was out of order, you just said something was wrong. I didn't want no parts of that because I didn't want the responsibility of that. And I know men say, well, I'm responsible. I take care of all the bills. This ain't got nothing to do with the finances of the dollar. This has something to do with being the proper order. And because I never experienced what that looks like, I was hesitant. Matter of fact, not hesitant, I was rebellious of going against that because I didn't want to have anything to do with that. I was like, well, the money come home, you take care of the bills, you pay the bills. Uh, and if I'm truthful, that's how it was in my house. My mother paid the bills, and that is what I grew up and that's what I saw. But to Danielle's point was the reason I was hesitant because it was taking me out of my comfort zone. It was taking me into a place I was not familiar with, and I didn't want no parts of it.
No, that's so good. And it just, when you were sharing that, it just, took me to the spirit of fear.
Mm.
God said he did not give us a spirit of fear, but power, love, and a sound mind. But you were operating in a space of fear because of the unknown, because you were uncertain. Why? Because you were not in, like you said, intimate spiritual relationship with God.
Hmm.
Yeah, you went to church, but that don't bring intimacy with God.
Church, private schools, Catholic schools,
All the
all
things.
godly schools.
And guess what? God ain't halfway in none of the conversations.
Not at all.
Nope, it's compliance. And so the critical part of that was because you weren't willing to do it God's way, then guess what? He used me as the vessel and removed that source of income out of our household in order to force your hand, right? Now, granted, there were some components in there for me because we were raising daughters, right? So there
Hmm.
was a place that God wanted me to be home to also impart into our daughters, but I love to work. So that was a struggle for me. So I had to deal with my own walk in that, right? But nevertheless, I just had to learn what it looked like and how to do it differently. But what I couldn't do was interfere with when I'm saying, God, I'm looking for my husband to lead because that's what he's been called to do. God says, this is the process of which to do it. I have to be willing to follow in obedience.
Hmm.
That part of obedience was me leaving my job. He didn't leave the job just for the sake of it, but it was in your response. It was in response to your rebellion against him. So he said, okay, you want to keep looking at her for the finances? You want to keep looking at her as your source? Well, guess what? I'm going to remove her out of the picture. Your little God, right? He removed me out of the picture. Now you forced to deal with him. So now you in the struggle. Now you're
Hmm.
really in the battle. Now you got to figure out what this looks like, and you got to do it apart from me bringing in the funds to help you.
And I know a lot of men that I coach. Some of their prayers is their wife find a job, and like Danielle said, this has nothing to do with a woman not wanting to work. Right? God is okay with that. He's fine with that. What he's not okay with is that the man is not going to him for the resources. That's what he's not okay with. So your wife can be bringing in $10 million, right? You still should be going to God for the resources because He's a provider of it all. And that's what Daniel Point was trying to say. More so of because the household was built on two incomes. I'm like, well, this income is removed, then it's a lot of stuff that comes out of that as well, right? But God wasn't trying to remove the income. He's trying to get me to get on the page and seek Him for the resources. So instead of saying, okay, well, how we, what we got to do to pay these bills or get this car or take this vacation, it's going to Him. Even if Danielle is working, it's still going to Him and say, okay, Lord, we want to go on vacation. What does this look like? How do we prepare for it? How do we save? He brings it to me, then I take it to her, and then we both pray on it at the same time. And that wasn't happening at all. I'll be like, oh, we need this, and we need to get this. So we would just have those conversations versus me going to God first and getting the answer for him, and then bringing it to my wife, and then moving forward. So I want y'all to understand, God is not trying to stop. He's okay with the success that comes with working. What he's not okay with is you taking what he's given you and doing what you want to do with it, right? Because you're not the owner. He's giving it to you to manage. That's what he's not okay with. And because if he owns it all, just like the garden, Adam didn't own the garden. Adam didn't plant one tree or didn't do anything, but he put it in the place that he gave Adam the ability to manage it. So if Adam had a question about something, what do? You go to the owner, right? You go to the owner. If you work for a company, you don't make changes without going to the owner, right? You usually walk in there and say, well, I don't want blue lights, I want red lights. You have to go to the owner first, right? And get permission because you just been placed there to manage. And we've been placed here to manage what God has given us.
Yeah, and I just want to insert this before we wrap it up real quickly, just to say this. We're being matter of fact about this.
Mm-hmm.
However, it was not walking this out as a matter of fact.
Oh, no.
And what I mean by that is the struggle was real. For years after the Lord told me to leave my job, my husband was not okay with that. He struggled and fought tooth and nail to come against me to say, you need to go back to work. I'm praying that God would say, that you go back to work. And I would say, God willing, that would be the case, then I will obey. But at the end of the day, because my husband was still rebelling against God, then he was doing my way, the way I say it should be done, or it's not going to be effective.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, I had to be obedient to God. So I was never disrespectful to my husband when he would bring it to me. I would just say, well, you know what? You need to go back and take it back to God for further clarity. And if God willing, you want me to get my job back, then I will pursue that. So there was a real struggle. So we're not just saying this is, one and done, but because we went through the struggle, we know the outcome of it. We're trying to give you the information so you don't have to continue to struggle if you find yourself in this plight. And I just wanted to say this.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why we could fast forward to when we finally got it right, that to my husband's point, the way he just laid it out is the way it was supposed to be, right? When he finally surrendered to the Lord and stopped fighting that process of looking to me as his head, when Jesus clearly said, I'm the head of the man, the husband. Once he got into alignment, husband, once you started to do that, that's when it really started to change. Then you was following God's instructions.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? To this day, let me just say this. It was 10 years before God allowed me to go back to work and make a dollar. And to be honest, our expenses, our housing expenses, and God moved us across the country and all the things, all that happened on the one income. And the one income that he had, and as he has walked with God to continue to bring about the resources, because you tapped into God as your source. So we ain't hit no lottery. I didn't go back to work in a traditional sense. Guess what? You started to work with God. And guess what? God started to what? To provide for you the way he intended in the first place, the way you rejected initially, which is why you had to take the long, hard road down, right, to get to this point.
And that's what I was going to, because I think it's important that there's always a goal at the end of the rainbow when we share our stories. So we don't just share our story, just like the wilderness. The end of the rainbow for them was the promised land. So God don't break promises. He doesn't lie. So to Danielle's point, the ability to me starting to rely on God and provide, you know, it's been a wonderful thing. He's elevated us ever since we moved down here to Atlanta, just on one primary main income, right? At the end of the day. And again, we're not telling anybody to leave their job. We're not telling that. We're telling you that if you got two parties working, it is the responsibility of the man to go to God to ask to continue to provide the resources through the man. And then the wife is working. That's almost like just an extra in some type of form of fashion. Again, as we kind of wrap this up, we would love to hear your story, to comment on what you think about where's your financial, alignment with God. Are you struggling with your husband or your wife? Y'all have separate bank accounts. Do you really know, is your husband going to God for provision, or is he out there working 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week to try to provide? Comment and let us know.
And don't forget to like and share. Did we say subscribe?
No.
Oh yeah, we got to subscribe. So anywho, well, hopefully, us just kind of sharing some thoughts. That's pretty much what we did. We just kind of jumped on here and shared some thoughts with you. Hopefully, it gave you some food for thought, right? It dropped some seeds that get you pondering. Because we always want to make sure that you take the information you receive back to the Lord for further understanding, further clarity on
Mm-hmm.
how you can apply these things to your own life and marriage. And so, yeah, so we appreciate you for tuning in and listening. And we always want you to know that you are not alone because we
We
are
are all
all
walkers
walkers united
united.
in Christ. See you next time.
Peace.